3 years ago, I pretended to be a helpless broke widower to test whether my own family still loved me when I had nothing left to offer. Last Tuesday, my son-in-law threw a glass of ice water in my face in front of his wealthy partners, laughing as he called me a useless freeloader. My daughter stood just a few feet away, calmly sipping her wine and saying nothing. I didn't argue. I didn't react. I simply walked away. The next morning, I handed him an envelope he thought contained the deed to my house. When he opened it, the truth inside terrified him so badly he collapsed on his own patio. Thank you for being here and taking a moment to listen to this story. Before we go further, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Also, some elements have been slightly fictionalized for storytelling and educational value, and any resemblance to real names or places is purely coincidental. The sharp thud of a fist striking the marble kitchen island rang through the cavernous room like a gunshot. The sound lingered in the air, bouncing off the vaulted ceilings and polished stone surfaces. Charles stood across from me, his face flushed red, the result of too much imported scotch and a lifetime of unchecked entitlement. His designer suit was perfectly tailored, a piece of fabric that likely cost more than many people earned in an entire month. He stood confidently in a kitchen so large it could easily pass for a small suburban home. "I need that signature right now, Benjamin," he said, sliding a thick stack of legal papers across the cold marble surface toward me. His tone was sharp, impatient, and dripping with authority he believed he deserved. "I'm not asking for a favor. I'm offering you a chance to finally contribute something to this household. I'm launching a high-frequency crypto investment firm on Monday. The capital requirements are enormous, and most of my liquidity is tied up in commercial real estate deals. The bank needs collateral for a bridge loan. You're going to sign over the deed to the guest house so I can leverage the equity." I remained still studying the young man who had married my only daughter. His confidence was absolute, almost theatrical. Slowly, I looked down at the document spread across the island. It wasn't a loan agreement. It wasn't temporary leverage. It was a full legal transfer of ownership, an unconditional surrender of the only property I supposedly possessed in the world. Charles I replied calmly, keeping my voice steady, despite the anger rising quietly in my chest. "You're asking me to surrender the deed to the roof over my head, so you can finance a highly volatile cryptocurrency startup. That isn't an investment. That's a gamble, and it's a gamble using the only asset I have left. I'm not signing it." A harsh laugh burst from his throat, loud and mocking. The sound carried easily through the open floor plan of the mansion. At the custom dining table in the adjoining room, 3 young men turned their heads toward us. They were Charles's potential business partners, men in their late 20s, with expensive watches, luxury sports cars, and vocabularies built almost entirely from corporate buzzwords. They watched the confrontation with casual amusement. "It's not your asset," Benjamin, Charles said, with a sneer, stepping closer. His voice carried the tone of someone explaining a simple concept to a child. "It's a building sitting on my land, a guest house on my estate. The only reason you're living there is because I allow it. You've been here for 3 years since your wife died, living rent-free. You eat the food my chef prepares. You use the electricity I pay for. Do you have any idea what it costs to maintain someone your age?" His words were delivered casually, but each one carried the deliberate edge of humiliation. Instead of answering him, I turned my attention to the woman standing on the other side of the marble island, my daughter. Lauren leaned lightly against the counter, dressed in a sleek silk evening gown that shimmered softly under the warm kitchen lighting. In her hand, she held a glass of dark red wine, slowly swirling it as though the scene unfolding before her were little more than background noise. I waited. I waited for the daughter I had raised to step forward. I waited for the little girl I once carried on my shoulders, the child whose nightmares I soothed and whose victories I celebrated. I waited for her to tell her husband to stop, to show even a shred of respect. Lauren took another measured sip of wine before finally meeting my eyes. There was no warmth there. "Charles is right, Dad," she said casually. Her voice carried a quiet cruelty that cut far deeper than any shouted insult. "You really do owe us. We've gone out of our way to accommodate you. You're a 65-year-old widower. What exactly do you need financial independence for anymore? You don't travel. You don't buy anything. You just sit in the garden, reading old books all day. Charles is trying to build something meaningful for our family, and you're standing in his way out of stubborn selfishness." Her words landed with a cold, crushing weight in the center of my chest. In that moment, I realized something painful, but undeniable. The daughter I loved was gone, In her place stood someone shaped entirely by comfort, privilege, and quiet greed. She no longer saw a father standing in front of her. She saw a liability, a declining asset, an inconvenient obstacle blocking the path to her husband's next financial scheme. The realization settled over me slowly, like winter frost spreading across a field. Still, I gave her one final chance. "Lauren," I said, gently, keeping my tone calm, despite the heaviness building inside my chest. "If I sign this deed and Charles's crypto venture collapses, the bank will foreclose on that guest house. I'll have nowhere to go. I'll be out on the street with nothing. Are you truly comfortable taking that kind of risk with my life?" Lauren rolled her eyes slowly, the gesture heavy with impatience. An irritated sigh slipped from her lips as she placed her wineglass down on the marble counter with a sharp, deliberate click. The sound carried through the kitchen like a small punctuation mark to the humiliation already hanging in the air. "Stop being so dramatic, Dad," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. Her tone carried the casual indifference of someone brushing aside an inconvenience rather than speaking to her own father. "Charles is a financial genius. This venture isn't going to fail. And even if it somehow did, we would simply move you into a comfortable assisted living facility. Honestly, at your age, that's probably where you belong anyway. Now, just sign the papers and stop embarrassing us in front of the guests." For a moment, I said nothing. I looked down at the legal documents spread across the marble island. The crisp pages gleamed under the warm kitchen lights, each line of text carefully crafted to strip away the only property I supposedly owned in this world. My eyes lingered on the signature line, waiting patiently at the bottom of the final page. Then I reached forward. Slowly and calmly, I placed my hand on the stack of papers and pushed them back across the marble surface toward Charles. "My answer is no," I said clearly, my voice steady and controlled. "I will not sign away my home to finance what is essentially a high-stakes gamble. This conversation is finished." For a brief moment, the room fell into stunned silence. Then Charles's expression twisted. His face tightened into a mask of pure fury, the veins in his neck rising visibly against the collar of his expensive silk shirt. The rejection struck him like a personal insult. Worse still, it happened in front of his audience. His wealthy friends were still seated at the dining table in the next room, watching the confrontation with growing curiosity. Charles lived his life on the fragile illusion of absolute control. The idea that an elderly man with supposedly no money could openly defy him in his own kitchen was something his ego simply could not tolerate. "You ungrateful old parasite," Charles hissed. The words left his mouth like venom, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. Before anyone could react, his hand shot forward. He grabbed the heavy crystal glass of ice water resting on the counter beside him. The glass caught the light for a brief second before his arm swung outward in a violent motion. A split second later, the contents were flying directly toward my face. The icy water struck me like a slap. Cold liquid exploded across my glasses and forehead. Several ice cubes bounced sharply off my temple and dropped to the polished marble floor, skittering noisily across the stone surface. The freezing water soaked through my lenses, ran down the bridge of my nose, and seeped into the collar of my worn cardigan. The sudden shock of the cold was immediate and biting, but it was nothing compared to the silence that followed. The entire kitchen fell quiet. The only sound was the faint drip of water hitting the marble floor beneath my shoes. From the dining room, one of Charles's partners let out a quiet chuckle. It was low and cruel, the kind of laugh meant to signal that the spectacle had been entertaining. Charles stood directly in front of me, breathing heavily. The rage on his face had already begun to fade, replaced by a smug smile of satisfaction. "You are a freeloader, Benjamin," he said, pointing a rigid finger at my soaked chest. "A pathetic, useless burden. You'll sign those papers by tomorrow morning, and if you don't, I'll have security drag your belongings out of that guest house and throw them on the street. I'll change the locks and make sure you never step foot on this property again." He paused for a moment, his smirk widening. "Now, get out of my sight." Water dripped slowly from my chin. It landed in quiet droplets on the marble floor below. I did not lift a hand to wipe my face. I did not speak. I did not allow a single flicker of the fury rising inside me to show on the surface. Instead, I slowly turned my head. My eyes found Lauren. I looked directly at my daughter, searching her face carefully. I wanted to see how she would react to what had just happened. I wanted to know if the sight of her husband physically assaulting her elderly father would awaken even the smallest trace of humanity within her. For a brief second, our eyes met. Lauren glanced at my dripping face. Her expression remained completely blank. There was no shock, no embarrassment, no anger on my behalf, nothing. Without saying a word, she turned away from me. She lifted her wine glass again, taking a calm sip, before walking toward the dining room where the guests were waiting. She did not look back. She did not acknowledge my existence. And in that moment, something inside me quietly ended. The father she once knew disappeared forever. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the kitchen. The cool night air outside struck my wet clothes as I crossed the perfectly manicured lawn. The darkness wrapped around the estate, the distant lights of the main house glowing behind me like a world I no longer belonged to. I reached the small guest house at the edge of the property. Inside, I closed the door carefully and locked the heavy deadbolt behind me. I shut every blind, sealing the room away from the outside world. The silence inside felt dense and absolute. I removed my soaked glasses and dried them slowly with a towel. Each movement was calm, measured, deliberate. Then I walked to the side of the bed. Beneath it, a section of wooden flooring sat slightly loose beneath a rug. I pulled the rug aside and pried up the plank with practiced precision. Hidden beneath the floorboards was a compact black lockbox. I lifted it out and placed it on the bed. The metal felt cool and heavy in my hands. I entered the combination without hesitation and opened the lid. Inside rested a device I had not touched in more than 5 years. An encrypted satellite phone. I pressed the power button. The screen flickered to life, filling the dark room with a pale blue glow. I waited patiently as the secure signal locked into place. When the connection stabilized, I dialed a number I knew entirely from memory. The line rang once, then a second time. A deep, calm voice answered on the other end. "Good evening, Mr. Harrington," Bennett said. "Bennett." I replied, my voice calm, measured and cold enough to cut through the quiet of the room. The testing phase is officially over. They failed. Activate everything. Freeze every shadow account. Initiate the forensic financial audit on Charles Maddox, and prepare the foreclosure protocols. We're taking the entire structure down. Understood, Sir Bennett answered immediately. His tone carried no surprise, no hesitation, only the efficiency of a man accustomed to executing devastating legal maneuvers. The machinery will be fully operational by sunrise. I ended the call and placed the phone carefully back inside the box beside me. Charles Maddox believed he had just humiliated a powerless old man, a man too weak, too poor, and too frightened to fight back. What he did not realize was that he had just declared war on the man who secretly owned the very ground he was standing on. The physical assault might have ended in that kitchen, but the systematic destruction of their lives had only just begun. The neon sign of the Midnight Diner flickered violently outside its red light, reflecting in long streaks across the rain-slick asphalt. It was 2 o'clock in the morning, the kind of hour when the city felt hollow and abandoned. I sat alone in a cracked vinyl booth in the back corner, nursing a cup of black coffee that tasted faintly like burnt copper. The diner smelled of grease-old toast and industrial cleaning chemicals. It was a world away from the polished marble counters and imported wine racks of my son-in-law's immaculate kitchen. And yet, sitting there in that worn booth, I felt more comfortable than I had in months. I preferred reality to expensive illusions. The small bell above the glass door chimed sharply. Bennett stepped inside, shaking cold rain from the shoulders of his dark wool overcoat. He carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who billed $2,000 an hour, a senior partner, at one of the most aggressive corporate law firms on the East Coast. In boardrooms, executives trembled when he spoke. Judges listened carefully when he stood. Yet here he was in the middle of the night, sliding into a cracked diner booth, across from an old man wearing a damp, inexpensive cardigan. Bennett did not care about the cardigan. He knew exactly who I was, and more importantly, he knew exactly what I was capable of. He placed a thick leather briefcase on the sticky laminate table between us. The waitress approached, her eyes half closed with exhaustion. Bennett ordered black coffee without looking at the menu. When she walked away, he turned his full attention toward me. "I'm sorry about what happened tonight," Benjamin Bennett said quietly. His voice carried neither sympathy nor judgment, only professional acknowledgement. "I reviewed the security footage from the guest house cameras you installed last month. The assault was completely unprovoked and legally actionable. We can file criminal battery charges immediately." I slowly shook my head. My hands were still cold, and I wrapped them around the warm ceramic mug as if trying to absorb its heat. "A simple assault charge is a temporary inconvenience," I said. Bennett listened without interrupting. Charles would pay a fine, hire a polished defense attorney, and turn the entire situation into a performance. I continued. He'd spin a story about the unbearable stress of dealing with a confused aging father-in-law. He'd claim I provoked him. Within weeks, he would be back at his country club, laughing about it over expensive whiskey. I looked up at Bennett. "I do not want to inconvenience him," I said quietly. "I want to dismantle him." Bennett gave a small nod. The conversation had shifted from personal grievance to strategic execution. His expression hardened into the focused professionalism that had made him feared in corporate litigation. He unlatched the briefcase. Inside were folders, documents, and neatly organized financial reports, the tools of a quiet war. 10 years earlier, long before tonight's humiliation, my life had already begun to change. That was when my wife received her diagnosis: terminal cancer. The word had landed like a hammer against my chest. At the time, I had already spent 40 years building Harrington Global Logistics. What began as a single delivery truck and a rented warehouse had grown into an international supply chain empire operating across multiple continents. In the industry, I was considered a titan, but at home, sitting beside my wife's hospital bed, I was simply a man terrified of losing the person who had stood beside me through every struggle and every victory. During those final months, we had many long, painful conversations about the future. One night, as the hospital room lights dimmed and the machines hummed quietly beside her bed, she held my hand and spoke with a clarity that still echoes in my mind. She warned me about the wealth. She warned me that money attracts parasites. And she warned me that our own daughter Lauren was already beginning to show signs of a dangerous kind of greed. Before she closed her eyes that night, she whispered one final request. "Protect what we built," she said. "Protect our legacy." So I vanished without ever truly leaving. I disappeared in plain sight. Through a series of carefully orchestrated transactions, I sold the entire logistics empire to a private equity firm. The deal was executed through an aggressively fortified blind trust layered with legal firewalls designed to make the ownership trail impossible to trace. When the dust settled, I walked away with more than $800 million fully protected, legally insulated, and invisible to anyone who might try to follow the money. To the outside world, and more importantly to my daughter, the story looked very different. According to the narrative, everyone believed my company had collapsed under the weight of overwhelming medical bills. The treatments, the specialists, the hospitals, the expenses had drained everything until nothing remained. A tragic but believable ending. A widower who lost both his wife and his fortune. I allowed that story to spread. Then I moved into the guest house behind my daughter's mansion. I played the part perfectly. I wore inexpensive clothes bought from discount stores. I drove a 10-year-old sedan with fading paint and a cracked dashboard. I carried myself like a man who had once been successful, but now lived quietly on the fragile edge of retirement. But the performance had a purpose. I needed to know something. I needed to know whether my only child would still love me when I had absolutely nothing left to offer her. No wealth, no influence, no inheritance. Only my presence. Tonight, I received my answer. The test was officially over. Across the diner table, Bennett opened his briefcase and removed a thick stack of manila folders. He arranged them neatly in a straight line on the sticky laminate surface with the methodical precision of a surgeon preparing instruments. "Let us begin with the primary residence," Bennett said calmly as he opened the first folder. "Charles believes he is a financial mastermind," he continued. "He frequently boasts to his friends about the extraordinary mortgage rate he secured for that $8 million mansion. He genuinely believes he outmaneuvered the lending market." A bitter, humorless laugh escaped my throat. Charles Maddox was many things, but a financial genius was not one of them. What he never realized was that he did not obtain his loan from a traditional bank. The boutique lending firm that financed his extravagant lifestyle was not what it appeared to be. The firm was a shell corporation, one that Bennett had quietly created years earlier, and I was the sole shareholder, which meant something Charles never suspected. I literally owned the mortgage on the house where he had just thrown water in my face. Only hours earlier, he had demanded the deed to my small guest house, completely unaware that I already owned the land beneath his custom Italian leather shoes. Bennett turned a page in the folder and tapped a manicured finger against a detailed financial ledger. "He has missed 2 consecutive mortgage payments," Bennett said. "Every liquid asset he has is currently being funneled into a speculative cryptocurrency venture he believes will multiply his wealth." Bennett's tone remained clinical. "The mortgage contract he signed contains extremely aggressive default terms. A third missed payment triggers an immediate default clause. No court delay. No negotiation period. He looked directly at me. If the third payment fails, we can initiate a direct foreclosure and seize the property within 72 hours. I studied the numbers on the page. For 3 long years, I had watched Charles strut through that mansion like a king. I watched him treat the household staff like disposable servants. I watched him treat me like a stray dog he had reluctantly taken in out of forced charity. All the while, he never realized something. I had been secretly paying the property taxes he could not afford. I had quietly been funding the illusion of his success. I closed the folder slowly. Initiate the default, I said. My voice sounded colder than the rain beating against the diner windows. He likes to talk about financial independence. Let's give him a masterclass in aggressive debt collection. Bennett wrote a brief note on his legal pad without hesitation. His expression never changed. He was not a man, he was a weapon. And tonight I had finally pulled the trigger. However, Bennett said, after a moment pausing with the pen in his hand. He looked up at me with a sudden sharpness in his eyes. The missed mortgage payments are actually the least of your son-in-law's problems. My attention sharpened immediately. While preparing the foreclosure audit, my forensic accounting team discovered something far more serious. Bennett continued, Charles has not simply been making reckless investments. Bennett slid another folder from the briefcase. This, he said quietly, is criminal. He placed the second folder on the table. And your daughter is fully involved. My posture stiffened instantly. Greed was one thing. Crime was something else entirely. I leaned forward across the table as the background noise of the diner seemed to fade into silence. Show me, I said. Bennett opened the second folder. A red stamp marked the cover in bold letters. Confidential. Inside were dozens of documents, bank statements, loan agreements, forged signatures, shadow applications filed with multiple high-risk lenders. The war we had quietly begun was no longer just a financial correction. It had just escalated into something far more dangerous. Bennett pushed the folder toward me carefully, as though the contents inside might detonate. The stack of papers felt noticeably heavier than the first, not because of the weight of the paper, because of the weight of what they revealed. Bank statements, notary seals, signed legal contracts, evidence. I opened the cover slowly. The harsh fluorescent lighting of the diner reflected off the pages as I examined the first document. Loan applications from 3 separate high-risk private lenders. My eyes settled on the first page. A promissory note, $400,000, dated 6 months earlier. And the borrower's signature stopped my breath for just a moment, because the name written on that line was mine. At the bottom of the page beneath the block of legal text and fine print was the line designated for the primary guarantor. The name written there was mine, Benjamin Harrington. For a moment, I simply stared at it. The signature beneath the name was an astonishingly accurate imitation of my handwriting, the slight forward lean of the letters, the long tail on the G, even the small hesitation mark I always made before finishing the final stroke. I studied the ink carefully. Charles had not forged this casually. He had perfected it. This was the result of deliberate practice hours of observation and repetition, until the rhythm of my handwriting had become second nature to him. My eyes followed the curves of the signature slowly. He had probably taken samples from the most harmless places. The birthday cards I occasionally gave them, the grocery lists I left on the kitchen counter, perhaps the small notes I sometimes wrote to remind myself to pick up medication or call the accountant. Simple, mundane pieces of everyday life. Charles had taken those quiet personal fragments and turned them into weapons. He had used the most ordinary details of my existence to execute high-level financial fraud. I turned the page. Another loan agreement, $600,000. The page after that revealed a third document, $300,000. My jaw tightened as the pattern became clear. Over the past 6 months, Charles had secretly borrowed nearly $1.5 million using my name as the guarantor. The documents showed fabricated equity claims tied to the small guest house where I lived. He had constructed an entire financial narrative around property he did not own. The supporting paperwork was disturbingly thorough. Fake tax returns, fabricated bank statements, digitally manipulated notary seals. Every piece of evidence had been carefully assembled to support the lie. Charles had built an enormous fragile house of cards, one that relied entirely on my identity as its foundation. Across the table, Bennett leaned forward slightly. His voice blended with the steady percussion of rain hitting the diner windows. Your son-in-law has been lying to everyone, Benjamin Bennett said. His tone remained calm and analytical. His commercial real estate projects are not simply underperforming. They are completely insolvent. The properties are heavily leveraged and generating almost no revenue. Bennett tapped a document with the tip of his pen. He currently owes millions to several aggressive private creditors. These lenders operate outside the traditional banking structure. They do not follow the usual regulatory protections. He paused briefly before continuing. The cryptocurrency company he was bragging about tonight is not a promising new venture. It is a desperate gamble. Bennett slid one of the bank statements closer to me. Charles is attempting to bet his way out of a financial crater. He pointed to a section highlighted in yellow on the third statement. This is the reason he needed your signature tonight, Bennett explained. He was trying to secure one final bridge loan. His shadow lenders have already cut him off. No one is willing to extend him further credit. Bennett folded his hands together. He is drowning in debt created by his own arrogance. And he decided that the most convenient life raft available was you. The explanation continued with the cold precision of a financial autopsy. He intentionally avoided regulated banks, Bennett said. Instead, he approached unregulated private equity lenders who rarely verify documents thoroughly. As long as the collateral appears legitimate on the surface, they approve the loan. Bennett glanced down at the paperwork again. To them, a retired widower living quietly on a luxury estate looked like perfect collateral, silent, wealthy, unlikely to dispute anything. A dull sickness twisted in my stomach. It was not about the money. The money meant nothing to me. I had hundreds of millions safely protected in blind trusts beyond anyone's reach. What sickened me was something far darker. The cold calculation behind Charles's actions. For 6 months, he had looked directly into my eyes. For 6 months, he had greeted me at breakfast, accepted the occasional meal I cooked, and nodded politely across the table during Sunday dinners, all while systematically stealing my identity, all while quietly arranging the complete financial destruction of my life. And tonight, he had the nerve to call me a freeloader. Tonight, he had accused me of living off their charity while he was actively robbing me blind. But the worst revelation had not yet appeared. Bennett was studying my face with careful attention, measuring my reaction before he spoke again. Look at the guarantor sections on page 4 of each contract, Bennett said quietly. His voice lowered slightly, specifically the cosigner lines. I turned to the 4th page of the thickest loan agreement. My forged signature was printed clearly near the bottom of the document. Directly beneath it was another name, Lauren Maddox. The sight of it froze me completely. This signature was not forged. I knew it instantly. I had watched Lauren write that exact signature hundreds of times. On elementary school homework assignments when she was 8 years old. On college applications years later. On the marriage certificate she signed the day she became Lauren Maddox. Her handwriting had always been distinctive, rushed, looping, confident, and unmistakably hers. The air in my lungs turned to something heavy and gray. For several seconds I could not breathe. Charles being a monster was something I could accept. I had never trusted him completely from the day he first walked into my home. But Lauren was my daughter, my own flesh and blood, and now the truth was undeniable. She had known everything. She had not simply ignored her husband's arrogance or looked the other way when he treated me like an inconvenience. She had helped him. She had participated willingly in a federal crime against her own father. Images from earlier that evening flooded my mind. Lauren sitting calmly at the kitchen counter. Lauren sipping imported wine while Charles shouted at me. Lauren telling me that I should be grateful for the room they allowed me to occupy. All while knowing that she had already helped steal $1.5 million in my name, my mind began to reconstruct the logistics of the crime. Charles could not have executed this alone. Lauren must have intercepted my mail. She must have retrieved old tax documents from the attic storage boxes. She had access to everything, my social security information, my financial records. Every detail needed to fabricate my identity. She had used the trust I gave her as my daughter to facilitate the theft. Bennett finally broke the silence that had settled over the table. She co-signed every fraudulent document he said, quietly. She personally authorized the transfer of the stolen funds into their joint accounts. His voice remained professional, but the implications were devastating. She is not an innocent spouse who was manipulated by Charles. Bennett's eyes met mine. She is a full co-conspirator. He tapped the folder gently. If we deliver these files to federal investigators, both of them will be indicted. The words felt heavy in the air. Your daughter will face charges alongside her husband, Bennett continued. Wire fraud, identity theft, bank fraud. He paused briefly before delivering the final assessment. And based on the evidence, the sentencing guidelines are not light. Bennett closed the folder slowly. If convicted, Lauren Maddox will be looking at a minimum of 5 to 10 years inside a federal penitentiary. I closed the folder slowly. The cardboard cover struck the table with a dull final sound that echoed louder in my mind than it should have. It was not just paper hitting laminate. It felt like the closing of a chapter that had taken my entire life to write. For a moment, neither Bennett nor I spoke. The diner remained quiet around us. At the far end of the room, the tired waitress moved methodically along the counter, wiping it down with a damp cloth that smelled faintly of disinfectant. She hummed under her breath, completely unaware that, in booth number 4, a family had just collapsed into ashes. I stared at the tabletop. My thoughts drifted back to the kitchen only hours earlier. Lauren standing there, silent, still, watching. I remembered the moment Charles hurled the glass of freezing water into my face, the shock of it, the cold running down my collar and soaking into my shirt. But what stayed with me was not the water. It was Lauren's reaction, or rather the lack of one. She had simply turned her back. No anger, no protest, no hesitation. Just a quiet decision to look away. I thought about the expression in her eyes when I asked a simple question. If she was truly comfortable putting me out on the street, there had been no guilt there, no struggle, only a hollow indifference. The memory pressed heavily against my chest. I had spent my entire life trying to shield her from the cruelty of the world. From the moment she was born, every decision I made was built around protecting her future. When her mother died, I made a promise beside that hospital bed. I told myself that no matter what happened, Lauren would never feel the desperation that destroys families. She would never know the humiliation of poverty. She would never face the fear of not knowing whether tomorrow would bring food or safety. So, I built something enormous. I built Harrington Global Logistics from nothing but stubborn will and sleepless nights. A delivery truck, a rented warehouse, a handful of employees who believed in the same impossible dream. Over 4 decades, that dream grew into an international empire, and every brick of that empire had been laid with the same purpose: to give my daughter a life free from suffering. Even after I sold the company and hid my wealth, I stayed close to her. I accepted the role of the poor widower living quietly in the guest house. I wore cheap clothes. I drove an old car. I swallowed the occasional insult with a quiet smile, because staying near her felt more valuable than pride. But tonight she had made her decision. She had chosen a counterfeit mansion built on stolen money over her own father, all for a few more months of luxury. I lifted my eyes and looked across the table at Bennett. Something inside me shifted. The grief that had been suffocating my chest only minutes earlier began to dissolve. Not disappear entirely, but harden. It cooled. It crystallized. What remained was something stronger, colder, a kind of emotional armor that nothing could easily penetrate. In that moment, I understood a painful truth. The daughter I had loved no longer existed. Perhaps she had disappeared gradually over the years. Perhaps she had vanished the moment she married Charles Maddox. Either way, the person sitting in that kitchen tonight was not the child I had raised. She was a stranger who saw me not as a father, but as an asset, a resource, something to be exploited and discarded once its usefulness expired. I leaned back slightly in the booth. She made her choice, Bennett, I said. My voice carried no hesitation, no sorrow. I am no longer her father, and she is no longer my daughter. The words felt strangely calm as they left my mouth. They are simply 2 criminals who made a fatal miscalculation. Bennett remained silent, waiting. Prepare the evidence for the federal prosecutor. I continued. We will deliver the dossiers directly to the authorities tomorrow morning. I paused briefly before adding the final instruction. There will be no warning. My voice grew even colder. No negotiations, no time for them to move money or hire defense attorneys. They had chosen to gamble with my life and my dignity. They wanted to play a high-stakes game, I said quietly. Now they will learn what happens when they sit at the table with a man who secretly owns the entire casino. Bennett nodded once. His expression remained composed, but there was a certain finality in the gesture. He gathered the thick financial folders from the table and slid them carefully back into his leather briefcase. The brass lock snapped shut with a sharp metallic click. The sound reminded me of a prison door closing. The machinery of their destruction was now fully engaged. Charles Maddox believed he had won a great victory tonight. In his mind, he had humiliated a powerless old man in front of his friends. He had no idea that the war had only just begun, and he certainly did not realize that every piece on the board already belonged to me. Bennett reached once more into the bottom compartment of the briefcase. At first I assumed the financial evidence had been the final revelation, but the grim set of his jaw suggested otherwise. He withdrew a thin manila folder. Unlike the thick financial dossiers we had just reviewed, this one was light, almost delicate. Bennett placed it carefully on the table in front of me. For a brief moment, he rested his hand on top of it. The gesture looked almost like someone steadying an object before impact. This did not come from the forensic accountants, Bennett said quietly. His voice had changed, lower, more dangerous. This was flagged by the cybersecurity team monitoring the corporate servers. He paused before continuing. Charles is not a particularly intelligent criminal, Benjamin. Bennett tapped the folder gently. He used his company email to communicate with a probate attorney. That detail carried an important implication. The company Charles worked for was technically owned by my trust, which meant every server connected to that business was subject to internal monitoring. We have full legal access to those communications, Bennett said. His eyes met mine. You need to read this carefully. I opened the thin folder. Inside was a printed email chain. Beneath it lay a drafted legal document. The title sat boldly at the top of the page, Petition for Emergency Conservatorship. For a moment, the words felt unreal. They seemed less like legal terminology and more like a physical threat printed in ink. I began reading, paragraph after paragraph of legal language. My eyes moved steadily across the page as a deeper horror slowly took shape. This was not a loan application. It was something far worse. It was a formal petition asking the state to declare me legally incompetent. If approved, it would strip away my most basic human rights, my autonomy, my financial control, even my personal freedom. I continued reading. Charles and Lauren claimed I was suffering from rapidly progressing dementia. They alleged that I was becoming unstable, prone to sudden and violent outbursts. My pulse slowed as I reached a specific paragraph describing the events of tonight. The document claimed that I had attacked Charles in the kitchen during a paranoid episode. According to the petition, he had been forced to restrain me for everyone's safety. My blood turned cold. They had taken his assault on me and twisted it into evidence of my supposed mental decline. Bennett watched silently as I read. They plan to file this Monday morning, he said. They are requesting an emergency ex parte hearing. That meant the judge would hear the case without notifying me first. They want temporary control over you before you can defend yourself, Bennett continued. Before you can hire your own legal counsel. He leaned slightly forward. If the judge signs the order, Benjamin, you stop being a free man, the consequences unfolded like a nightmare. They would have legal authority to place me in a locked psychiatric facility. They would control every financial account, every medical decision, every aspect of my daily life. I would not be allowed to drive, or vote, or decide what to eat for dinner. I turned to the second page. It was an affidavit, fully drafted, waiting only for a notarized signature. The statement was written in Lauren's voice. I read the words slowly. She claimed she feared me. She claimed there were days when I no longer recognized her. She claimed I had become a danger to myself. According to the document, placing me in a secure medical facility was the only compassionate solution. She was prepared to stand before a judge and swear under oath that her father had lost his mind. Also, her husband could secure collateral for a fraudulent cryptocurrency scheme. As the realization settled in, another disturbing truth emerged. Lauren must have been observing me for weeks, perhaps months, quietly collecting small moments, distorting them into medical symptoms. If I misplaced my reading glasses, she recorded it as cognitive decline. If I preferred quiet time in the garden instead of listening to Charles boast about money, she labeled it depressive withdrawal. Every peaceful moment of my life had been twisted into evidence for a cage. The financial fraud had been motivated by greed, but this petition was something darker, something far more deliberate. They did not just want my money, they wanted to erase me completely. They wanted to lock me away in a sterile white room until the day I died, all so they could continue their extravagant lifestyle without the inconvenience of my presence. I slowly lifted my eyes from the document. The diner around me suddenly felt distant and distorted, as though I were viewing it through a thick layer of water. The betrayal was so absolute, so profoundly unnatural, that it pressed against my chest like a physical force. For decades, I had devoted every ounce of my strength to building a fortress around my family. Every long night, every calculated risk, every sacrifice had been made with one purpose: protection. And now my own daughter was forging the chains she intended to lock around my wrists. Bennett broke the heavy silence. "This development changes the parameters of our response," he said smoothly. His tone was calm, almost clinical. "We are no longer merely defending your financial assets. We are defending your freedom." He tapped the thin folder lightly with one finger. "If they file this petition on Monday morning, it will automatically trigger an investigation by Adult Protective Services. That investigation alone could entangle us in probate court for months. It gives them leverage time and legal momentum." He met my eyes directly. "We cannot allow this document to see the light of day." I closed the folder slowly. The paper felt almost toxic beneath my fingertips. The emotional armor that had begun forming when I saw Lauren's signature now hardened into something far stronger. The faint traces of paternal softness that still lingered inside me disappeared completely. Any fragile hope that my daughter might someday rediscover her conscience evaporated. She was no longer a misguided child. She was a predator, dangerous, calculated. In that exact moment, I understood the reality of the situation with perfect clarity. Leaving their property would not be enough. Cutting off their financial support would not be enough. They had crossed a boundary that could never be undone. What they planned was not theft. It was imprisonment. If their scheme succeeded, I would spend the remainder of my life locked inside a psychiatric facility, while they drained my identity like a bank account. That could never be allowed to happen. They needed to be removed from my life completely, surgically, permanently, and it had to happen before Monday morning. "You're right, Bennett," I said quietly. My voice sounded eerily calm. "We cannot simply allow the foreclosure process to move slowly in the background." I leaned forward slightly. "We need to paralyze them." The words felt precise, controlled. "We strike fast, hard enough that they never even have time to lie to a judge." I glanced toward the digital clock glowing red above the diner kitchen. 3 a.m. In just a few hours, Charles would host his brunch meeting on the patio. He had invited several prospective investors, men whose money he desperately needed to keep his collapsing financial scheme alive. He planned to show them the mansion, the cars, the lifestyle. He would present himself as a confident young entrepreneur, standing on the edge of massive success. He expected me to appear with the deed to the guest house. He expected me to surrender. He expected me to remain exactly what he believed I was, a weak-old man. "Bennett," I said, turning back to him, "I want the foreclosure notice finalized and sealed tonight." My thoughts were moving with razor-sharp clarity. "I also want the federal indictment referral prepared regarding the wire fraud." I paused briefly. "But most importantly, I want a printed copy of this exact conservatorship petition." I tapped the folder, placed all 3 documents into one envelope. Bennett studied me carefully. For a brief moment, a flicker of genuine respect crossed his otherwise controlled expression. "You intend to hand-deliver the trap," he said. "Yes," I replied simply. "He expects a document from me tomorrow." I allowed a faint cold smile to form. "I will give him exactly what he asked for." The image in my mind was crystal clear. I want him to open that envelope in front of every investor he's trying to impress. I continued slowly. I want him to read the foreclosure notice and realize that the mansion he's standing in no longer belongs to him. I leaned back slightly. I want him to read the federal fraud referral and understand that prison is no longer a distant possibility. My voice lowered, and then I want him to see the conservatorship petition. I paused. "So he knows with absolute certainty that I understand exactly what kind of monster he truly is." Bennett nodded slowly. "We will freeze all of their financial assets at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning," he said while making notes on his pad. "By the time he opens that envelope, every credit card he owns will be useless." He continued writing. "Every bank account will be locked." Bennett glanced up briefly. "He won't even be able to buy a cup of coffee." "Good," I said. "And Lauren." The name felt strange now, almost foreign. "When the freeze happens, include her personal accounts." Bennett nodded again. "She co-signed the fraudulent loans," I continued. "She is legally liable." I spoke the final instruction without emotion. "Strip her of every dollar." Bennett closed the briefcase slowly. "Consider it done, Benjamin." He stood up from the booth and buttoned his coat. "I'll have the envelope delivered to the guest house by courier before 9 in the morning. He paused before leaving. "Try to get some sleep. A faint, grim smile crossed his face. Tomorrow will be destructive. I watched him step out into the rain. The neon lights from the diner reflected across the wet pavement in distorted streaks of red and blue. I did not feel tired. Instead, I ordered another cup of black coffee. For a long time, I sat alone in that quiet diner. The coffee cooled slowly in my hands. My thoughts drifted back to memories I had not allowed myself to revisit in years. A small girl holding my hand in the park. Lauren laughing as she tried to chase pigeons across the grass. Her tiny fingers wrapped around mine as we crossed the street. For a moment, I mourned that little girl. I grieved for the daughter I had lost somewhere along the road. But the woman living in that mansion now was not that child. She was someone else entirely. Someone who had tried to steal my freedom. Someone who had tried to erase me. I finished my coffee. Then I stood and stepped outside into the cold night air. The rain had softened to a fine mist. I drove the old sedan back to the estate in silence. The mansion stood dark and quiet when I arrived. I parked near the guest house and walked inside without turning on the lights. Sleep never came. Instead, I sat in the living room, watching the darkness slowly fade. Gradually, the horizon brightened. The sun began to rise over the carefully manicured lawns. I waited. I waited for the courier. I waited for the morning. I waited to dismantle their world. The sunrise painted the estate in warm gold. Long shadows stretched across the imported stone patio behind the mansion. It was a beautiful Saturday morning, the kind of morning that suggested peace. From the window of the guest house, I watched a pristine white catering van roll slowly down the driveway. The staff stepped out carrying silver trays loaded with lobster rolls, imported caviar, and delicate champagne flutes. Charles Maddox was hosting his brunch. He had spared no expense. 3 private equity investors had been invited to attend, men whose capital he desperately needed to keep his fraudulent cryptocurrency venture alive. Across the garden, I could hear Charles's voice clearly. He laughed loudly, an exaggerated sound meant to project confidence and authority. He stood at the head of a long teak dining table, dressed in crisp white linen. His tailored linen suit looked expensive. His gestures were wide and theatrical as he pointed toward the sprawling estate. I listened as he explained the supposed history of the property. According to his story, he had acquired it through brilliant negotiation. He spoke proudly about the renovations he claimed to have designed himself. Every word was a lie, but the illusion was convincing. Luxury sports cars gleamed in the circular driveway. Champagne worth thousands of dollars flowed freely into crystal glasses. Charles spoke endlessly about his business philosophy, about discipline, about ethical leadership, about sophisticated risk management. To the investors sitting around that table, he appeared to be exactly what he wanted them to see. A young titan of industry, unstoppable, successful. Lauren stood beside him. She wore a flowing designer sundress and smiled warmly at the guests. Every time Charles spoke another lie, she nodded in agreement. She played her role flawlessly. The supportive wife, the elegant hostess. From across the garden, I watched her directing the catering staff with sharp hand gestures. Her tone carried the same cold impatience she had used with me the night before. To the investors, the scene looked perfect. A wealthy young couple living the dream. They had no idea the illusion was about to collapse. She had no idea that precisely 2 hours earlier, at exactly 8 o'clock, Bennett had executed a complete legal freeze on every bank account connected to her name. At that very moment, she was standing on a patio that no longer belonged to her eating food she could no longer afford, entirely unaware that a financial guillotine had already been positioned above her head. Inside the quiet sanctuary of the guest house, I did not reach for my usual clothes. The worn khaki pants stayed in the drawer. The faded wool cardigan remained hanging on its hook. Those garments belonged to a role I was no longer willing to perform. The test was over. Humility had served its purpose. Now it was finished. I walked to the back of my closet and pulled down a heavy canvas garment bag. The zipper slid open with a soft, metallic sound. Inside hung a charcoal gray suit, bespoke perfectly tailored for me in London during the final year of my tenure as Chief Executive Officer of Harrington Global Logistics. I removed it carefully. The fabric still carried the faint scent of cedar from long storage. I dressed slowly and deliberately, a crisp white dress shirt, a dark silk tie. Then the suit jacket settling across my shoulders like a familiar piece of armor. Finally, I slipped my feet into polished black leather Oxford shoes that had once crossed the floors of international boardrooms from Singapore to Frankfurt. When I stood before the full-length mirror, the transformation was absolute. The fragile, defeated widower was gone. The man staring back at me was someone else entirely. He was the man who had built a global logistics empire from a single delivery truck and a rented warehouse. My posture straightened naturally. Years of calculated humility fell away like dust. The strength returned to my jaw. The quiet authority that had once commanded entire corporations settled back into place. I picked up the thick sealed white envelope resting on the kitchen counter. Inside were 3 documents: the formal foreclosure notice, the federal fraud indictment referral, and the drafted conservatorship petition they had prepared to imprison me. It was more than paper. It was the physical embodiment of their destruction. I stepped outside and began walking across the manicured lawn toward the patio. This time, I did not shuffle. My stride was steady, deliberate, controlled. The stride of a man who owned the ground beneath his feet. The morning breeze caught the fabric of my suit jacket as I moved forward. Gravel crunched beneath my leather shoes, each step producing a slow, rhythmic sound that carried across the garden like distant thunder announcing an approaching storm. As I drew closer to the patio, the conversation among the investors gradually weakened. One of the men noticed me first. He was older, with neatly combed silver hair, and the sharp eyes of someone accustomed to evaluating powerful people. His attention drifted away from Charles and fixed directly on me. Recognition flashed across his expression. Not recognition of my face, recognition of presence. He saw the unmistakable authority in my posture. He noticed the flawless cut of a suit that easily cost $10,000. And he understood immediately that I did not belong in the humiliating story Charles had likely been telling them about his pitiful, dependent father-in-law. Charles sensed the shift in attention. He turned around. For a fraction of a second, his confident smile faltered. He blinked once, visibly thrown off by what he saw. He had expected the broken old man from the night before, the one he had soaked with ice water and pushed towards submission. He expected trembling hands delivering a surrendered deed. Instead, he saw something entirely different. He saw the man who had once commanded billion-dollar negotiations. But Charles Maddox's ego was far too inflated to allow genuine fear to enter his mind. He recovered quickly. The smirk returned to his face as he turned back toward his guests with a dismissive wave. "Ah, gentlemen," Charles announced loudly, projecting confidence across the patio. "This is my father-in-law, Benjamin." He chuckled lightly. "I apologize for the interruption. As I mentioned earlier, he's going through a bit of a difficult transition phase." Charles glanced at me again with mocking amusement. It appears he decided to play dress-up for the occasion. Lauren turned slowly, her eyes locked onto me. Confusion spread across her face as she examined the expensive suit. Then her gaze dropped to the thick white envelope in my hand. Charles stepped away from the table and moved quickly toward me, positioning himself between me and the investors. He lowered his voice to a harsh whisper, though the polite smile remained glued to his face for the watching audience. "You actually put on a suit," Charles muttered. His eyes slid greedily toward the envelope. "I assume that's the signed deed to the guest house." He extended his hand impatiently. "Good. You finally realized you don't have a choice." His voice hardened. "Hand it over." He nodded toward the house behind him. "Then go back to your little room and let me finish securing this capital." I did not give him the envelope. Instead, I stood perfectly still. I looked directly into his eyes. I wanted to memorize that expression, the arrogance, the confidence, the absolute certainty that he had already won. I wanted to remember how he looked in the final seconds before everything collapsed. Behind him, the investors had stopped speaking entirely. They were watching closely. Men like them survived by reading subtle signals, tone, posture, authority. The tension radiating from our interaction was impossible to ignore. Even the morning birds seemed to fall silent. The clinking of silver forks against porcelain plates stopped. The entire patio felt suspended in a moment of anticipation. The stage was set. I stepped forward fully onto the imported stone patio. The heavy soles of my Oxfords struck the stone with slow, deliberate echoes. The 3 investors watched every movement. They were men who calculated risk for a living, men who understood power the moment they encountered it. And right now, every instinct they possessed was telling them the same thing. The story Charles Maddox had just sold them was built on a lie. The man they were told was a broke and senile burden was walking toward them, wearing a suit that cost more than their luxury watches, carrying himself with the absolute posture of a king, surveying his conquered territory. I did not look at the investors. I kept my gaze locked entirely on Charles. He stood at the head of the long teak dining table, a crystal champagne flute frozen halfway to his mouth. The smug and dismissive smile he had worn just seconds ago was beginning to crack at the very edges, replaced by a sudden twitch of nervous energy he could not quite hide. The morning breeze carried the scent of expensive catered food and blooming jasmine, a stark contrast to the thick hostility radiating from the center of the patio. Charles set the glass down on the table. The sharp clink of the expensive crystal against the polished wood sounded like a gunshot in the incredibly tense morning air. He forced a broad and condescending smile, desperately attempting to regain control of the stage he thought he owned. He puffed out his chest and let out a loud theatrical chuckle, turning his head to wink directly at the wealthiest investor sitting to his right. He was playing a dangerous game of pretend, trying to convince these powerful men that my sudden and imposing presence was simply a quirky family dynamic. He took 2 steps toward me, extending his hand as if he were greeting a subordinate who had finally learned his proper place in the hierarchy. He looked at the thick white envelope resting in my right hand, his eyes lighting up with unadulterated greed. Finally, the old man understands how business works. Charles said, his voice dripping with a sickly sweet patronization that echoed across the quiet garden. He reached out his hand, his fingers twitching with anticipation. "Did you bring the signed deed, Benjamin? It is about time you stepped up and contributed to this family. I am glad you finally saw reason. Just hand it over, and we can get back to securing the future of this company." Lauren stepped out from behind her husband, crossing her arms over her designer sundress. She looked me up and down, her face twisting into an ugly and confused sneer. She could not comprehend the transformation standing before her. "Where did you even get that suit, Dad?" she demanded, her tone laced with pure venom and a hint of genuine insecurity. "Are you trying to embarrass us by dressing up like a banker? Give Charles the papers and go back to the guest house immediately. We are hosting a highly confidential corporate meeting here. You are completely out of your element, and you are ruining the morning." I did not look at my daughter. She was already a ghost to me, a total stranger standing in a house she no longer had the legal right to occupy. I focused entirely on the arrogant young man reaching for his own absolute destruction. I did not hand him the envelope immediately. I held it suspended in the space between us, forcing him to wait, forcing him to feel the sudden and massive shift in gravity. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. The investors shifted uncomfortably in their padded teak chairs. They could smell the blood in the water. They knew a transaction of power was happening right in front of them, and they knew Charles was not the one in control. I looked Charles directly in the eyes, stripping away the false mask of the feeble widower he had abused the night before. I let him see the absolute and icy ruthlessness of the man who had crushed international competitors for 4 decades. I let him look into the eyes of a true corporate titan who was about to dismantle his entire existence. The arrogant smirk on his face faltered for just a fraction of a second, as a tiny seed of primal fear finally took root in his mind. "I brought exactly what you asked for, Charles," I said, my voice incredibly low, carrying a lethal calmness that made the warm morning air feel instantly colder. "I brought the documents that will permanently secure your future." I held out the heavy sealed white envelope. Charles snatched it from my hand with a victorious and arrogant smirk, quickly burying his momentary fear under a thick layer of delusion. He was eager to parade his dominance in front of his silent audience. He weighed the thick package in his hands, completely unaware that he was holding the legal equivalent of a live explosive. He thought he was holding the key to his financial salvation. He did not know he was holding the exact blueprint of his impending prison sentence. He ran his thumb under the sealed flap of the envelope, ready to reveal his prize to the world. "Before I reveal what was actually inside that envelope," comment, the number 1 below. "So I know you're still watching this story with me. Your support really keeps these stories alive." And just a quick note, some details in the upcoming story are slightly dramatized for storytelling purposes, though the message behind it is very real. Charles tore open the top of the heavy white envelope with eager, clumsy fingers. He was so desperate to claim his imagined victory that he ripped too quickly, tearing a small corner of the documents hidden inside. A scrap of the envelope fluttered down and landed on the immaculate stone patio. It lay there like trash discarded carelessly on an estate he still believed he controlled. He pulled the thick stack of papers from the envelope with a wide, arrogant smile. For a moment there was no sigh of relief, no triumphant laughter. He expected to see a simple property deed, one page, perhaps two, with my signature waiting obediently at the bottom in blue ink. Instead, he was holding a dense stack of formal legal documents stamped with the severe letterhead of one of the most feared corporate law firms on the eastern seaboard. The top page was printed on heavy textured paper. Charles shifted his stance and lifted the document slightly toward the sunlight, squinting as though the glare itself prevented him from comprehending what he was seeing. I watched his eyes move across the bold capital letters printed at the very top of the page. Notice of immediate foreclosure and seizure of property. For a brief moment, his mind refused to accept what it read. He blinked several times. His head shook slightly as though rejecting the words. Then his gaze dropped to the address listed in the center of the document. His address. The exact property. The ground he was standing on at that very moment. Next, his eyes darted to the name of the holding company that owned the mortgage. It was a boutique lending firm he knew well, one he had approached repeatedly during his frantic attempts to secure more funding over the past 3 years. But it was the line beneath that name that finally shattered him, printed clearly and unmistakably, the sole proprietor of that lending company, Benjamin Harrington. Charles looked up slowly. The arrogant smirk had vanished completely. His eyes were wide now, terrified. His mouth opened as if to speak, perhaps to demand an explanation, perhaps to shout an accusation, but no sound emerged. The words died before reaching his throat. He looked back down at the document. The foreclosure notice outlined everything, every missed payment, every overdue balance, the staggering total amount of his delinquent debt. At the bottom of the page, printed in cold legal language, was the final detail: 72 hours, 72 hours before formal eviction. In that moment, Charles understood something he had never even considered possible. He was not the owner of this estate. He was a tenant, a trespasser, a man living on land that belonged entirely to me. But the foreclosure notice was only the first layer of his collapse. His hands began to shake. The thick stack of papers rattled loudly in the still morning air. He flipped the page frantically, desperate to discover some kind of error, some kind of misunderstanding. Instead, he found the second document waiting. The federal indictment referral. I watched as the color drained from his face. His skin turned a dull gray while his eyes moved slowly across the legal charges printed in severe black type. Wire fraud, identity theft, federal bank fraud. The document detailed everything. Every shadow loan he had taken during the previous 6 months. Each one listed precisely. Exact dates, exact dollar amounts. Exact lenders. The legal summary described in methodical language how he had forged my signature on multiple promissory notes worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. And beneath that section, another detail appeared, highlighted: his wife, Lauren Maddox, named clearly as an active co-conspirator in the scheme. Charles realized then that I had not merely glanced at his finances. I had dismantled them, forensically, piece by piece, every lie uncovered, every theft documented. Every crime prepared for prosecution. The evidence was more than sufficient to send both him and Lauren to federal prison for the better part of a decade. The realization struck him like a physical blow. He inhaled sharply, a ragged breath. A bead of cold sweat formed at his temple and slid slowly down along his jaw. The confident entrepreneur who had been laughing moments earlier was gone. In his place stood a man staring directly into the possibility of prison. Across the patio, the 3 private equity investors observed everything in complete silence. They were experienced men. Their careers had been built on recognizing the smallest signs of financial instability. They watched Charles unravel in less than half a minute. Only moments earlier, he had been pouring champagne and describing his brilliant risk management strategies. Now, he stood trembling, sweating, unable to speak. The oldest investor pushed his chair back slowly. The padded legs scraped quietly against the stone patio as he rose. He set his linen napkin neatly beside his plate, distance both physical and professional. The other investors exchanged silent glances. They had reached the same conclusion. The man pitching them a cryptocurrency venture was hiding something catastrophic. Lauren noticed the change at last. She stepped closer, her designer heels clicking sharply against the stone. "Charles, what is it?" she asked. Her voice carried an edge of sudden panic. "Charles! What did he give you?" Charles could not answer. His throat tightened. His chest rose and fell rapidly as panic constricted his breathing. He flipped to the final page in the stack almost blindly. In his mind, things could not possibly grow worse. He believed the loss of his home and the threat of prison were already the lowest point imaginable. But the final document waited patiently at the bottom of the pile. The printed copy of the drafted petition for emergency conservatorship. The same document he had emailed to the probate attorney only hours earlier. The cruel legal request that would have declared me mentally incompetent and locked me inside a psychiatric facility. His eyes froze on the words. Recognition flashed across his face. This was the final blow, the killing strike. He understood instantly what it meant. I knew everything, not only about the stolen loans, not only about the forged signatures. I knew about the plan, the scheme to erase me, the attempt to cage me, and in that moment, Charles Maddox understood something far worse than foreclosure or prison. He understood that the man he believed he had defeated the night before had already seen every move he planned to make, and had crushed him anyway. He realized I had total access to his secure corporate servers. He realized there was absolutely nowhere he could hide from my reach. I had cornered him financially, legally, and psychologically. The heavy walls of his counterfeit life collapsed inward all at once, crushing him completely. He looked at me one final time. He did not see a frail widower. He saw the architect of his total ruin. He saw a titan who had just executed a flawless checkmate. The physical reaction was immediate and incredibly violent. Charles let out a high-pitched gasping sound, as if all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the beautiful garden. His hands lost all their strength. The heavy stack of legal documents slipped from his trembling fingers and scattered across the imported stone patio. The white pages blew gently in the morning breeze, landing near the expensive leather shoes of his prospective investors. Charles reached up and clawed frantically at his own throat, his eyes rolling back in his head. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a polished wax corpse. His knees buckled beneath him. He did not stumble gracefully. He simply dropped like a stone. He collapsed cold onto the hard patio, his body hitting the ground with a sickening heavy thud. He fainted dead away, right at the feet of the powerful men he was desperately trying to swindle. Lauren let out a piercing, horrified scream that echoed across the manicured lawns. She dropped to her knees beside him, grabbing his shoulders and shaking his limp body frantically. The three investors stood up immediately. They did not rush forward to offer medical assistance. They took several coordinated steps backward, their faces hardening into masks of pure professional disgust. They looked down at the legal documents scattered across the ground. The oldest investor recognized the bold red stamp of an FBI indictment referral on one of the pages resting near his shoe. He read the words "wire fraud," clearly visible in the morning light. He realized with chilling clarity that he had almost wired millions of dollars to a desperate criminal. The investors began walking away from the table, leaving their champagne glasses full. They were abandoning the toxic environment immediately. I stood perfectly still, watching the absolute chaos unfold at my feet. I did not bend down to offer help. I did not call for a doctor or a glass of water. I simply adjusted the crisp cuffs of my bespoke charcoal suit. Charles thought the battle was over, because his brain had forced him to lose consciousness to escape the terror. He did not understand that his physical collapse was merely the opening act of his nightmare. The investors now knew he was an absolute fraud. The money he desperately needed was gone forever. The silent war had just transitioned into a very loud and very public execution. The morning sun continued to warm the imported stone of the patio, but the atmosphere had turned completely frigid. I stood in my tailored charcoal suit and watched as Charles slowly began to stir. He let out a low, agonizing groan that sounded like a wounded animal. His perfectly styled hair was flattened against the hard ground, and his expensive linen suit was wrinkled and stained from where he had collapsed near a drop tray of catered caviar. He blinked his eyes open, staring blankly at the clear blue sky for a few seconds before the crushing weight of reality came rushing back into his brain. He gasped, pulling himself up onto his elbows. His eyes immediately darted to the scattered legal documents blowing gently across the patio. The foreclosure notice, the federal indictment referral, the drafted conservatorship petition. It had not been a nightmare. It was all violently real. Charles scrambled to his knees, frantically searching the surrounding area. He looked toward the long teak dining table, expecting to see the three wealthy private equity investors he desperately needed to fund his illusion. The chairs were completely empty. The expensive crystal champagne flutes were abandoned half full on the table. The catering staff had stopped serving and were quietly packing their silver trays into the white van, eager to escape the disastrous and incredibly tense scene. The investors had vanished, taking Charles's last hope of financial salvation with them. They had seen the federal fraud documents and fled the estate without saying a single word. Charles realized he was entirely alone. The bridge loan was gone. His reputation was permanently destroyed. He crawled across the stone patio, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the scattered legal documents. He tried to stack the foreclosure notice and the fraud referral together, as if organizing the papers could somehow undo the catastrophic damage. He looked up at me from his knees, his arrogant facade completely shattered. He looked like a terrified child. He opened his mouth to beg or to offer some pathetic excuse, but he could not find his voice. Lauren watched her husband kneeling on the ground, in a state of absolute ruin. The shock that had paralyzed her moments ago quickly mutated into a blinding, desperate rage. She could not process the fact that their lavish lifestyle was officially over, so she directed all of her venom entirely at me. She marched across the patio, her designer heels striking the stone like little hammers. She stopped inches from my face, her eyes wide and bloodshot with fury. "Look at what you did to him!" She screamed, her voice cracking with loud hysteria. "You malicious, bitter old man! You ruined his meeting. You caused him to collapse. I am calling the police right now. I am going to tell them you physically attacked him. I will tell them you came out here in a psychotic rage and struck my husband. They will arrest you, Benjamin. They will drag you out of here in handcuffs and lock you in a cell where you belong." She reached into her expensive designer purse and pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling violently as she prepared to dial the authorities. She was fully prepared to manufacture a felony assault charge against her own father just to maintain her delusion of control. She wanted to punish me for exposing the truth. I did not take a single step back. I did not raise my hands in defense or offer a frantic denial. I simply looked down at her with absolute pity. I waited for her to unlock her phone screen before I finally spoke. "Go ahead and call them, Lauren." I said, my voice perfectly calm and steady. "Tell them I assaulted him. Tell them I am a violent threat. But before you make that call, I suggest you turn around and look up at the roofline of the guest house." Lauren paused, her thumb hovering over the screen. She slowly turned her head, following my gaze across the manicured lawn. Tucked discreetly beneath the eaves of the small building were 3 high-definition security cameras. I had installed them months ago when I first began to suspect Charles was snooping around my property looking for financial documents. They were small black domes, completely unnoticeable unless you knew exactly where to look. They have full audio and visual recording capabilities. I explained, watching the blood rapidly drain from her face. They are currently transmitting directly to a secure cloud server managed by my legal team. They recorded you and Charles standing on this patio, just now, proving I never laid a single finger on him. And more importantly, they recorded exactly what happened last night. They captured Charles throwing a glass of freezing water directly into my face while you stood by and did absolutely nothing. They captured my completely peaceful exit. Lauren dropped her hand holding the phone. The threat of calling the police evaporated instantly into the warm morning air. She stared at the small black domes and realized that every single lie she had planned to tell the authorities was completely useless. If the police arrived, they would not arrest me. They would review the high-definition footage. They would see the unprovoked battery from the night before, and they would arrest her husband for elder abuse. She had tried to weaponize the law against me without realizing I had already built an impenetrable fortress of digital evidence. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She was entirely trapped. She could not lie her way out of this situation, and she could not bully me into submission. The power dynamic had permanently shifted in a matter of minutes. I was no longer the frail, dependent father she could easily manipulate and discard. I was the architect of their absolute downfall, and I had anticipated every single desperate move they would try to make. I looked at the two of them one last time. Charles was still kneeling on the ground, clutching the documents that proved his guilt, and Lauren was standing frozen in silent terror. They had built a massive house of cards using my money and my name, and I had just calmly removed the foundation. The panic in their eyes was absolute and undeniable. But I knew this was only the beginning of their long and painful descent into reality. Charles scrambled backward away from the security cameras as if the small black domes were suddenly going to project a laser and strike him down. The reality of the digital trap had completely shattered his last remaining offensive strategy. He could not fight me physically, and he could not use the police to manufacture a false narrative. He grabbed Lauren by the arm, his fingers digging into her expensive silk sleeve, and dragged her toward the massive sliding glass doors of the mansion. They retreated into the house like two frightened rats fleeing a sinking ship. I remained standing on the patio, the morning sun warming the shoulders of my tailored suit. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the sprawling living room, I watched the next phase of my carefully orchestrated plan unfold with absolute precision. Charles was pacing frantically across the imported Persian rug, his hands tearing through his perfectly styled hair. He was operating purely on the primal instinct of a cornered criminal. The arrogant veneer of the successful entrepreneur had been completely burned away, leaving only a desperate man facing decades in a federal penitentiary. He knew exactly what an FBI indictment referral meant. He knew that the authorities would eventually knock on his massive custom oak front door, and he knew he could not be sitting in the living room when they arrived. His mind was racing through the limited options of survival. He needed a ruthless defense attorney who charged $10,000 a day, or he needed a private jet to a country without an extradition treaty. Both of those escape routes required one specific resource, and he believed he still had access to it. He needed immediate liquid cash. I watched him reach into the pocket of his wrinkled linen trousers and pull out his smartphone. His hands were shaking so violently that he nearly dropped the device onto the hardwood floor. He was sweating profusely, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand as he desperately tried to unlock the screen. The facial recognition software failed to register his features because his face was contorted in pure panic. He had to manually type in his passcode, his trembling thumbs missing the numbers twice before he finally gained access to his digital life. Charles opened his primary banking application. This was the master account, a high-yield private wealth portfolio, where he kept the remnants of his legitimate business earnings intermingled with the massive sums of money he had stolen using my forged signature. He fully intended to initiate an immediate wire transfer, moving every single penny into an untraceable offshore cryptocurrency wallet he had set up months ago. He waited for the loading screen to clear his eyes wide and unblinking. He expected to see a balance of over $2 million. He expected to see the financial safety net he had built on a foundation of absolute fraud. The screen loaded and displayed his total available balance, $0. I could see the physical jolt travel through his entire body, even from my vantage point out on the patio. He stopped pacing and stood perfectly still, staring at the glowing screen. He tapped the refresh icon, frantically convinced it was merely a temporary network glitch or a display error. The small loading circle spun rapidly for a second, and then settled on the exact same horrifying number, $0. Charles let out a breathless sound and quickly navigated to his secondary accounts. He opened the portal for his commercial real estate holding company, the account he used to pay the exorbitant mortgage on the counterfeit mansion. It was completely frozen. He checked his high-limit platinum credit cards. The available credit lines had been completely revoked, displaying a negative balance indicating the accounts were permanently locked. Every single digital vault he tried to open was sealed tight. He did not understand the sheer magnitude of the legal snare Bennett had placed around him. Charles thought he was dealing with a standard civil dispute. He did not know that at exactly 8 o'clock this morning, Bennett had submitted a massive binder of forensic financial evidence to an emergency federal judge. The judge had seen the forged promissory notes, the shadow loans, and the undeniable proof of wire fraud. Based on that overwhelming evidence, the judge had immediately granted an ex parte order to freeze all assets connected to Charles Maddox and his affiliated shell companies to prevent the dissipation of stolen funds. The legal guillotine had fallen hours before Charles even woke up to host his disastrous brunch. Charles began breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his ruined shirt. He dialed the direct phone number for his private wealth concierge at the bank. He paced back and forth near the large stone fireplace, holding the phone tightly to his ear. I watched his mouth moving rapidly as he demanded an immediate explanation. He was likely screaming at the bank representative, threatening to close his accounts and sue the institution for restricting his money. His tirade lasted exactly 10 seconds before the concierge spoke. I could not hear the words being said on the other end of the line, but I could read the exact moment the bank representative informed Charles of his true situation. Charles stopped pacing. His shoulders slumped forward as if an invisible weight had just been dropped directly onto his neck. The representative was calmly explaining that the bank was strictly complying with a federal freeze order related to an active criminal fraud investigation. They informed him that his accounts were indefinitely suspended, that they could no longer conduct business with him, and that any further inquiries must be directed to the federal authorities. Charles slowly lowered the phone from his ear. The digital screen went dark. He He was completely severed from the global financial system. He could not wire money to an offshore account. He could not hire a defense attorney to keep him out of prison. He could not even buy a tank of gas to drive his luxury sports car away from the estate. The legal trap was absolutely flawless. Lauren realized something was catastrophically wrong. She walked over to him, grabbing his arm and shaking him, demanding to know why he looked like he had just seen a ghost. Charles turned his head and looked at her, his eyes completely hollow. He told her the money was gone. I saw Lauren aggressively shake her head in denial. She refused to accept the reality of her sudden poverty. She pulled her own gold-plated smartphone from her designer purse, her fingers moving with frantic speed as she opened her personal banking applications. Lauren had always maintained separate accounts to fund her lavish shopping habits and her imported wine deliveries. She assumed her money was safe because she falsely believed she was insulated from her husband's chaotic business ventures. She logged into her primary checking account. She stared at the screen, her mouth falling open in a silent scream. Her balance was also absolute zero. Bennett had not missed a single detail. My legal team had thoroughly documented Lauren co-signing the fraudulent loan applications. By knowingly attaching her name to the forged documents, she had made herself entirely legally liable for the stolen funds. The federal judge had not hesitated to include her personal assets in the emergency freeze order. She was a full co-conspirator, and she was now facing the exact same financial obliteration as her husband. Lauren dropped her phone onto the hardwood floor. The screen cracked loudly, a fitting metaphor for her shattered existence. She grabbed the lapels of Charles's jacket, screaming in his face, hitting his chest with her fists. She was demanding that he fix the situation, demanding that he magically produce the millions of dollars they needed to survive. But Charles just stood there, absorbing her blows with a vacant and defeated stare. He had absolutely nothing left to offer her. The illusion he had sold her was entirely bankrupt. I watched them turn on each other in the center of the massive living room. The grand chandelier hung above their heads, casting a brilliant light on their absolute misery. They were trapped in a cage made of their own greed. They could not fight, they could not run, and they could not buy their way out of the consequences. The legal trap had closed its steel jaws around them, snapping their future in half. I turned away from the glass windows, feeling a profound and cold satisfaction settling deep within my chest. I walked slowly back toward the guest house, leaving them to tear each other apart in the ruins of their counterfeit kingdom. I poured myself a glass of cold water and sat in the leather armchair near the front window of the guest house. I knew Lauren would not surrender easily. Her entire reality had just been dismantled, and people like her do not reflect on their mistakes when backed into a corner. They lash out with whatever weapons they can find. I watched the long driveway leading up to the estate, knowing she was currently inside the mansion, searching for a way to destroy me. It took exactly 20 minutes for her desperate retaliation to arrive. The flashing red and blue lights of 2 police cruisers cut through the peaceful morning air, reflecting harshly against the tall oak trees and the imported stone of the mansion. The vehicles parked at sharp angles near the front steps, their sirens silenced but their lights painting the manicured lawns in frantic colors. 4 officers stepped out of the vehicles, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. They had received an emergency call from a wealthy address regarding a violent domestic disturbance, and they were fully prepared for a chaotic and dangerous scene. I placed my water glass on the table and stood up, smoothing the front of my charcoal suit. I walked to the front door before they even had a chance to approach the porch. I opened the heavy wooden door and stepped out into the morning light. 2 officers were walking briskly across the lawn toward me. Lauren was trailing right behind them, putting on the performance of a lifetime. Her designer sundress was intentionally wrinkled, and she had smudged her expensive makeup to create the perfect illusion of frantic tears. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest. "Officers, that is him!" She cried out, her voice pitching perfectly into the register of a terrified victim. "He is having a complete psychotic break. He came out to the patio this morning and violently attacked my husband. He shoved Charles to the ground and threatened to kill us. He has severe dementia, and he has become completely unhinged. You need to arrest him and place him on an involuntary psychiatric hold right now before he hurts someone else." The lead officer, a tall man with a stern and evaluating expression, stepped onto the porch and raised a firm hand to instruct Lauren to stay back. He looked directly at me, evaluating the supposed threat. He clearly expected to find a confused, aggressive elderly man in a state of undress or extreme agitation. Instead, he found a perfectly calm 65-year-old man, wearing a bespoke suit, standing tall and exuding absolute authority. "Good morning, officers," I said, keeping my voice entirely level and polite. "Please come inside. There is absolutely no need for any alarm or force." The officer hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes scanning my calm demeanor before stepping across the threshold into the guest house. Lauren tried to follow him inside, desperate to keep her fabricated narrative alive, but I stepped slightly to the side, blocking her path entirely. "I am sorry, Lauren, but you are no longer welcome in my home," I stated clearly. The second officer turned and firmly asked her to remain on the lawn, which only infuriated her further. She crossed her arms and glared at me through the open doorway, her fake tears instantly replaced by a look of pure hatred. "Sir, we received a serious emergency call stating you committed a physical assault against your son-in-law," the lead officer said, taking out a small black notepad. "Do you understand these are very serious criminal allegations?" I nodded slowly, maintaining unbroken eye contact with the officer. "I understand perfectly, officer," I replied. "My daughter is currently attempting to manufacture a domestic violence charge because she and her husband are facing absolute financial ruin this morning. If you look at the roofline directly above your head outside, you will see 3 high-definition security cameras. They record directly to a secure cloud server. I invite you to review the footage from this morning right now. You will see that I never came within 5 feet of Charles Maddox. You will simply see him collapsing onto the patio from the sheer shock of reading a legal document I handed to him. Furthermore, if you review the footage from last night, you will witness Charles Maddox throwing a glass of ice water directly into my face in an entirely unprovoked attack." The officer stopped writing. He looked out the door and up at the roofline, spotting the small black domes, then looked back down at my perfectly pressed suit. His posture relaxed significantly, recognizing that the hysterical woman on the lawn had likely filed a false police report to manipulate them. Lauren realized her narrative was rapidly falling apart. She began to yell from the grass, claiming the cameras were fake, claiming I was a manipulative liar who had planted them there to spy on her family. I ignored her entirely. I walked over to the small mahogany desk in the corner of the living room and opened the top drawer. I bypassed the false assault allegation and moved directly to the fatal strike. "I am not interested in pressing battery charges against my son-in-law for the water incident," I told the officers, turning back around to face them. "I am, however, highly interested in reporting a massive federal crime that has been committed on this property over the last 6 months." I held up a small silver USB drive. I walked over and placed it gently onto the center of the coffee table. "This drive contains irrefutable forensic evidence of massive wire fraud, bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft," I explained. "Charles Maddox has forged my signature on multiple high-value promissory notes, stealing nearly $1.5 million from private equity lenders. My legal counsel, Bennett, has already submitted this exact evidence to a federal judge early this morning, resulting in a total asset freeze on both Charles and Lauren Maddox." The lead officer stared at the silver drive. Local patrol officers do not typically handle million-dollar federal fraud cases, but the specific mention of a federal judge and an active asset freeze fundamentally changed the nature of their visit. "Sir, if what you are saying is true, this is a matter for federal investigators," the officer said carefully, clearly realizing he had stepped into a massive corporate crime scene. I agreed with a slight nod. "I understand that, officer. However, Charles Maddox is currently inside that mansion, entirely desperate and completely stripped of his financial resources. He is a massive flight risk. I am formally requesting that you detain him for questioning regarding the identity theft and the false police report his wife just filed to facilitate his escape." The officer used his shoulder radio to contact dispatch. He requested a direct line to the federal courthouse to verify the emergency injunction I had mentioned. The radio crackled with static for 2 agonizing minutes. Lauren stood outside, her fake tears completely drying up as a new wave of authentic panic washed over her. She could hear the radio traffic echoing from the officer's shoulder. She knew the absolute truth was catching up to them at harrowing speed, and she could do absolutely nothing to stop the machinery I had set in motion. The dispatch operator finally responded, confirming the active federal freeze order connected to Charles Maddox and his affiliated holding companies. The operator also noted that the local precinct had already been notified to assist federal agents who were currently en route to the estate. The lead officer looked at me, a profound respect settling into his expression. He He picked up the silver USB drive and placed it securely in his uniform pocket. "Thank you for your complete cooperation, Mr. Harrington," he said, his tone entirely professional and devoid of any previous suspicion. "Please remain here in the guest house. We are going to speak with Mr. Maddox right now." The two officers walked out of the guest house and marched directly across the lawn toward the massive front doors of the mansion. Lauren tried to run after them, screaming for them to stop, begging them to listen to her fabricated story about my dementia one more time. They completely ignored her, their focus locked entirely on the massive front doors. I stepped out onto the porch and watched the final scene of their counterfeit life unfold. Charles had apparently seen the police cruisers arriving from an upstairs window and had mistakenly believed Lauren had successfully executed her plan. He confidently walked out the front doors, fully expecting to see me being hauled away in restraints. He even had a smug, arrogant smile returning to his face. Instead, the two officers grabbed his arms the exact moment he stepped onto the porch. They spun him around, violently pressing his chest roughly against the expensive custom oak door. The metallic click of the steel handcuffs echoing across the quiet estate was the most beautiful and satisfying sound I had ever heard. Charles shouted in pure shock, demanding to know what was happening, screaming that he was a wealthy property owner and they were making a terrible mistake. The officers read him his rights in a loud, clear voice, explaining he was being detained for suspected federal fraud and the filing of a false police report. They marched him down the stone steps, his designer shoes stumbling over the concrete, and pushed him roughly into the back of the police cruiser. Lauren fell to her knees on the grass, wailing loudly as she watched her husband being hauled away like a common street criminal. She had tried to use the law as a final weapon to destroy me, and the recoil had just completely shattered her entire world. The police cruisers pulled away from the estate, taking Charles to a concrete cell, leaving Lauren completely alone on the lawn of a mansion she no longer owned. The heavy oak front door of the mansion remained slightly open, swinging gently in the late morning breeze. Lauren stood perfectly still on the manicured lawn, watching the dust settle on the long asphalt driveway where the police cruisers had just vanished. She was entirely alone. For the first time in 3 years, the sprawling luxury estate felt completely hollow. She slowly walked back up the imported stone steps and entered the grand foyer. The house was meticulously designed to be a massive testament to wealth and corporate power, but right now, it just felt like a beautifully decorated tomb. She walked into the expansive living room, stepping over the shattered remains of her gold-plated smartphone, resting on the antique Persian rug. The catering staff had fled hours ago, leaving the patio doors wide open, and the remains of the expensive brunch spoiling in the warm morning sun. Lauren wrapped her arms around herself, feeling a sudden chill despite the heat of the day. She tried to convince herself that this was all a terrible temporary misunderstanding. She told herself that Charles would use his connections to hire a brilliant defense lawyer and sort out the fraud allegations before dinner. She clung desperately to the fragile delusion that she was still the wealthy lady of the house, and that her father was simply throwing a malicious temper tantrum that she could eventually manage. She walked into the massive gourmet kitchen, intending to pour herself a glass of imported sparkling water to calm her frayed nerves. She reached for the heavy stainless steel handle of the oversized custom refrigerator. The exact moment her fingers made contact with the cold metal, the persistent low hum of the luxury appliance completely stopped. A second later, the recessed lighting above the marble island flickered once and died. The digital displays on the double ovens went completely black. The gentle rush of the central air conditioning system faded into absolute silence. The massive house was instantly plunged into a heavy, suffocating stillness. Lauren stood in the dark kitchen, her heart pounding wildly against her ribs. She pressed the gold-plated light switch on the wall repeatedly, but absolutely nothing happened. She walked over to the deep porcelain sink and pushed the chrome handle upward. A brief hollow hiss of air escaped the faucet, followed by a few pathetic drops of water before the line went completely dry. She walked back into the living room and grabbed the wireless landline handset from its charging base on the console table. She pressed it to her ear, expecting to hear a dial tone, so she could immediately call the utility company and scream at a customer service representative. The line was completely dead. Bennett had not merely frozen their bank accounts and triggered a federal investigation. He had systematically dismantled the entire invisible infrastructure of their counterfeit life. For 3 years, my blind trust had secretly paid every single utility bill, property tax, and maintenance fee required to keep that massive estate operational. Charles and Lauren were so blinded by their own arrogance that they never once questioned why the electricity and water always flowed without them ever writing a check. The moment I gave Bennett the green light, he immediately canceled every single account associated with the property address. The harsh reality of the blackout pierced directly through Lauren's thick layer of denial. She was trapped in a dark, silent house with no running water, no working phone, no money, and a husband sitting in a federal holding cell. But instead of feeling remorse or gaining clarity, she felt a blinding surge of familiar entitlement. She immediately directed her rising panic into a furious anger, and she directed that anger entirely at me. She convinced herself that I had manually shut off the power from the main breaker box located in the guest house just to spite her. She simply refused to believe that the frail old man she had abused possessed the logistical power to completely sever her from the outside world. She stomped out the back door of the mansion, her designer heels crunching loudly against the gravel path leading toward my small residence. She was marching over to demand that I turn the power back on. She was going to scream at me, tell me that she was the innocent victim of Charles's lies, and demand that I open my wallet to fix her ruined life. She crossed the manicured lawn, her face twisted in an ugly mask of pure rage. She reached the small wooden porch of the guest house and did not even bother to knock. She grabbed the brass doorknob, turned it violently, and shoved the heavy door open with her shoulder. "Benjamin!" She screamed, her voice echoing harshly through the open doorway. "Turn the power back on right now and get out here." She stepped boldly over the threshold, fully prepared to unleash a torrent of verbal abuse, but the hateful words completely died in her throat. The guest house was entirely silent. The air inside felt strangely stale, devoid of the familiar scent of my brewing dark roast coffee or the old leather-bound books I used to read every afternoon. Lauren blinked her eyes rapidly, adjusting to the dim light filtering through the closed window blinds. She walked further into the small living room and stopped dead in her tracks. The room was completely empty. The worn-out armchair where I used to sit and watch television was gone. The small wooden dining table where I ate my modest meals was gone. The antique rug had been rolled up and removed, leaving only bare hardwood floors. She panicked and ran down the short hallway into the single bedroom. It was stripped entirely bare. The wooden bed frame was dismantled. The mattress was missing, and the closet doors were wide open, revealing empty wooden hangers and completely bare shelves. I had not merely packed a small suitcase and walked away. I had completely erased my physical existence from the property. While she was busy watching her husband being arrested and handcuffed on the front lawn, a specialized private moving crew, hired by Bennett, had quietly entered the guest house from the hidden rear access road. They had methodically packed up my entire life in less than 30 minutes and vanished without a single trace. I did not leave behind a stray sock, a forgotten book, or a single photograph. I had surgically amputated myself from her world. Lauren stumbled backward, her breath catching painfully in her throat. The sheer logistical precision of my departure finally broke through her massive arrogance. I was not hiding in the garden. I was not waiting nearby for an apology. I was permanently and entirely gone. She walked back into the empty living room, her legs trembling uncontrollably as the gravity of her isolation crushed her. As she turned to leave, she noticed a single piece of crisp white paper, taped securely to the inside of the front door, right at eye level. It was the only item left in the entire building. She walked slowly toward it, reading the bold black letters printed at the very top of the page. Official notice to vacate. It was a formal legal eviction order executed by the corporate holding company that now legally possessed the foreclosed estate. The document outlined in cold, uncompromising legal terminology that the current occupants had exactly 72 hours to remove all personal belongings and vacate the premises entirely. It detailed that the property was now classified as a seized asset due to severe mortgage default and pending federal fraud investigations. The notice explicitly stated that failure to comply would result in forced physical removal by the county sheriff's department and the immediate confiscation and auction of any remaining personal property left inside the mansion. Lauren stared at the paper, her eyes reading the terrifying words over and over again, as if the black ink might magically change if she stared long enough. There was no hidden loophole. There was no generous grace period. There was no wealthy, forgiving father waiting in the wings to pay her massive debts and stroke her hair. While telling her everything would be fine, she reached out and touched the heavy paper, her trembling fingers tracing the sharp black lines of the legal seal stamped at the bottom. The absolute finality of the situation crushed her completely. She had traded a billion-dollar inheritance and the unconditional love of a devoted father for a fraudulent husband and a counterfeit mansion she was about to be forcibly thrown out of. She slowly slid down the smooth wooden door, her back pressing against the hard surface until she was sitting directly on the bare floor of the empty guest house. She pulled her knees tightly to her chest and buried her face in her hands. She finally began to cry. These were not the fake calculated tears she had used to manipulate the police officers just hours earlier. These were the deep, agonizing sobs of a woman who had just realized she had completely and irreversibly destroyed her own life. The silent war was officially over. I had won without ever raising my voice, and she was left sitting entirely alone in the dark and empty ruins of her own devastating defeat. Federal courthouses are intentionally designed to make a person feel incredibly small. The towering marble pillars, the heavy mahogany doors, and the sharp echo of footsteps against polished stone are all meant to strip away the fragile illusions of personal grandeur. It is a place where counterfeit realities go to die. I walked through the metal detectors on Tuesday morning, wearing my tailored charcoal suit, with Bennett walking quietly right beside me. We were not there to participate in the proceedings. My legal team had already delivered the massive binders of forensic evidence directly to the federal prosecutor. I was there simply to witness the absolute conclusion of the silent war I had waged against my own family. We entered the courtroom and took our seats in the very last row of the wooden gallery benches. The room was freezing cold, smelling faintly of floor wax and old paper. I sat perfectly still, resting my hands on my lap. 3 rows ahead of me, sitting entirely alone, was Lauren. I spent a long moment simply looking at the back of my daughter's head. She was wearing the same designer sundress she had worn on the patio during Charles's disastrous brunch, but it was now terribly wrinkled and stained. Her usually immaculate hair was pulled into a messy knot, and her shoulders were slumped completely forward. She looked like a woman who had not slept or eaten in days. She had been forcibly evicted from the mansion 24 hours prior. Without access to her frozen bank accounts, she was likely sleeping in her car or begging old friends for a couch to sleep on. The friends she had bought with my money had undoubtedly abandoned her the second the federal freeze order became public knowledge. She was experiencing the terrifying freefall of sudden poverty, and she was completely unequipped to survive it. The heavy wooden door beside the judge's bench swung open, and a bailiff stepped into the room. He instructed everyone to rise. The federal judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes and an expression of absolute intolerance for nonsense, took her seat at the elevated bench. She adjusted her reading glasses and opened the massive file folder resting in front of her. The file was so thick it looked like a dictionary. It contained every single financial sin Charles had committed over the last 6 months. "Bring in the defendant," the judge commanded, her voice cutting through the silent courtroom like a steel blade. The side door leading to the federal holding cells opened with a loud metallic clank. 2 armed federal marshals escorted Charles Maddox into the courtroom. The transformation was absolutely breathtaking. The arrogant young visionary who had thrown freezing water into my face was completely gone. In his place was a broken, terrified man wearing a standard-issue, bright orange prison jumpsuit. His wrists were bound tightly in heavy steel handcuffs, attached to a chain wrapped around his waist. He shuffled his feet awkwardly, his expensive Italian leather shoes replaced by cheap slip-on canvas sneakers. He had spent the last 3 nights in a concrete cell surrounded by actual violent criminals, and the experience had completely shattered his fragile ego. His face was pale and unshaven. He looked physically smaller, as if the sheer weight of his impending doom had compressed his spine. He took his seat beside a tired-looking public defender. Because his bank accounts were entirely frozen, Charles could not hire the aggressive, expensive defense attorney he desperately needed. He was forced to rely on a court-appointed lawyer who was overworked, underpaid, and visibly exhausted. Charles turned his head, frantically scanning the wooden benches of the gallery. He was looking for Lauren, seeking some sort of comfort or validation. He found her and offered a pathetic, trembling smile. Then his eyes shifted to the back row, and he saw me. I did not glare at him. I did not smile. I simply looked at him with the cold, detached observation of a man inspecting a damaged piece of cargo. Charles physically flinched when we made eye contact. He quickly turned his head forward, staring blankly at the judge's heavy wooden desk. He knew I was the architect of the cage he was currently locked inside. The judge looked down at the prosecutor and then at the public defender. "We are here for the bail hearing of Mr. Charles Maddox," she stated flatly. "The charges are extensive. multiple counts of federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, bank fraud, and the filing of a false police report. Counselor, as we hear your argument for bail. The public defender stood up, straightening his cheap suit jacket. He did not sound confident. Your Honor, my client is a local business owner with deep ties to this community. The public defender began, his voice lacking any real conviction. He has no prior criminal record. The charges against him stem from a complex series of commercial real estate transactions that simply went bankrupt. He made some terrible accounting errors during a period of extreme financial stress, but he is not a violent threat to society. He is a married man. We are requesting a reasonable bond so he can return to his family and properly prepare his defense against these complex financial allegations. The judge listened to the plea without changing her expression. She looked down at the massive binder Bennett had provided. She slowly turned a page, the sound of the thick paper echoing loudly in the quiet room. Accounting errors. The judge repeated, her voice dripping with profound skepticism. Counselor, I have been on the federal bench for 20 years. I have seen men rob banks with shotguns, and I have seen men rob pensions with fountain pens. Your client did not make an accounting error. He executed a highly calculated, predatory, and malicious scheme of identity theft. The judge turned her attention directly to Charles. Stand up, Mr. Maddox, she commanded. Charles slowly rose to his feet, the heavy steel chains around his waist rattling loudly against the wooden table. He kept his head bowed, staring at his canvas shoes. I have spent the entire morning reviewing the forensic financial evidence provided to this court. The judge continued, her voice rising in volume and intensity. The sheer audacity of your crimes is genuinely staggering. You forged the signature of your 65-year-old father-in-law on multiple promissory notes. You used his identity to secure over $5 million in unregulated shadow loans to fund a fraudulent cryptocurrency scheme. You submitted fabricated tax returns and manipulated digital notary seals. That is not an accounting error, Mr. Maddox. That is a deliberate, sustained attack on the federal banking system. Lauren sat perfectly still in the gallery. She was hearing the exact numbers being read into the official court record. She was hearing a federal judge validate every single piece of evidence I had handed to Charles on the patio. The fragile wall of denial she had built around herself was being systematically dismantled by the highest authority in the room. But the judge was not finished. The financial fraud was only the foundation of her absolute disgust. However, the judge said, leaning forward over the heavy wooden bench, what I find truly reprehensible is the nature of your victim. You did not just defraud private equity firms. You actively exploited an elderly family member who was living on your property. The evidence submitted to this court includes high-definition video footage from the night before your arrest. I watched you throw a glass of ice water into the face of an older gentleman who was simply refusing to hand over the deed to his home. I watched you humiliate him. I watched you threaten to throw him out onto the street. You viewed your own father-in-law as completely disposable. Charles closed his eyes, a single tear escaping and rolling down his pale cheek. He was being publicly dissected. The illusion of the successful visionary was completely dead, and the reality of the monster he truly was had been exposed to the entire world. The judge picked up a specific document from the file. It was the drafted conservatorship petition I had found on his corporate servers. And perhaps the most sickening piece of evidence in this entire binder is this drafted legal petition, she stated, her voice shaking with righteous anger. When you realized you could no longer bully him into signing over his property, you conspired to have him declared mentally incompetent. You planned to stand before a probate judge and lie under oath to strip him of his basic human rights so you could steal his remaining assets. You attempted to weaponize the legal system to cover up your financial crimes. The judge set the paper down and took off her reading glasses. She looked at Charles with absolute, uncompromising contempt. Your public defender claims you are a successful business owner, the judge said. But the financial disclosures tell a very different story. You are entirely bankrupt. Your commercial properties are in default. Your primary residence is currently being foreclosed upon. And you have absolutely no access to liquid capital. But the most glaring miscalculation you made, Mr. Maddox, was entirely underestimating the man you were trying to destroy. This was the moment the earth shifted permanently beneath Lauren's feet. She leaned forward slightly in her wooden pew, her breath catching in her throat. She had always believed I was a pathetic burden. She was about to learn the exact scale of the titan she had crossed. The court has reviewed the ownership structure of the holding company that initiated the foreclosure on your estate, the judge explained. reading from a confidential financial summary provided by Bennett. The court has also verified the origin of the forensic audit that exposed your crimes. You believed you were stealing from a broke, vulnerable widower. You did not realize that Benjamin Harrington is the sole beneficiary of a blind trust valued at over $800 million. He is the former chief executive officer of Harrington Global Logistics. He secretly owned the mortgage on your home. He funded your entire lavish lifestyle from the shadows. You tried to steal $1 million from a man who possesses nearly $1 billion. You brought a forged piece of paper to a war against a financial giant. A collective gasp echoed through the small gallery. The public defender slowly turned his head and stared at his own client in absolute disbelief. Charles swayed on his feet, his knees buckling slightly under the crushing weight of the revelation. He had thrown water in the face of a billionaire. He had called the man who secretly owned his entire world a freeloader. The sheer magnitude of his stupidity was so vast, it defied human comprehension. But the reaction that truly mattered to me belonged to Lauren. I watched her back stiffen completely. Her hands gripped the wooden pew in front of her so tightly her knuckles turned entirely white. The judge's words hit her with the destructive force of a localized earthquake. $800 million. The number echoed in the cold courtroom. Lauren's mind was desperately trying to process the information. She realized that I had not been living in the guest house because I was poor. I had been living there by choice. I had subjected myself to her condescending comments, her coldness, and her husband's abuse, simply to test her loyalty. She realized that if she had simply shown me a shred of human decency, if she had simply treated me like a father instead of a burden, she would have eventually inherited an empire. She would have never had to worry about money for the rest of her natural life. Instead, she had co-signed fraudulent loans to steal a pathetic fraction of what would have been freely given to her. She had traded a massive generational fortune for a fake designer lifestyle that had just resulted in her complete eviction and impending criminal indictment. The emotional weight of her profound stupidity crashed down upon her all at once. Her shoulders began to shake violently, and a low, agonizing sob escaped her throat. The judge banged her wooden gavel sharply against the sound block, silencing the whispers in the courtroom. "Mr. Maddox, you are facing decades in a federal penitentiary," the judge declared, her voice ringing with absolute finality. "You have demonstrated a highly sophisticated ability to manipulate financial systems and commit fraud. You have no home to return to. You have no legitimate business ties. You are the very definition of a severe flight risk and a continuing danger to the financial community. Therefore, bail is categorically denied. You will be remanded to the custody of the United States Marshals and held in federal lockup until your trial." Charles let out a desperate, terrified wail. He lunged forward against the wooden table, begging the judge for a second chance, begging for house arrest, screaming that he would not survive in a federal prison. The two armed marshals immediately grabbed him by the shoulders, pulling him backward. The heavy steel chains rattled violently as he struggled against their grip. They dragged him away from the defense table, his canvas sneakers dragging uselessly against the polished floor. He looked over his shoulder as they pulled him toward the side door. He was not looking at the judge. He was looking directly at me. His eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated terror. He finally understood that I had not just taken his money. I had taken his freedom, his dignity, and his entire future. The heavy steel door slammed shut behind him, cutting off his screams and sealing his fate entirely. The judge closed the massive file folder. "We are adjourned," she stated, stepping down from the bench and disappearing into her private chambers. The courtroom slowly began to empty. Bennett stood up, buttoning his suit jacket, and gestured toward the main doors. We walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. As we passed the third row, Lauren slowly turned her head and looked up at me. Her face was completely streaked with dark mascara and tears. Her eyes were hollow, filled with a mixture of profound regret and absolute terror. She knew the federal agents would be coming for her next. She knew her signature was on those documents. She opened her mouth to speak. She wanted to beg. She wanted to call me Dad. She wanted to ask for forgiveness or a high-priced lawyer or simply a warm place to sleep tonight. But I did not stop walking. I did not break my stride. I looked directly into her eyes for a fraction of a second, allowing her to see the cold, impenetrable steel that had replaced my heart. I offered her absolutely nothing. No anger, no pity, and no salvation. I simply walked past her, leaving her sitting entirely alone on the hard wooden bench to face the devastating consequences of her own monstrous greed. Exactly 7 days passed since the heavy gavel fell in that freezing federal courtroom. I spent the entire week finalizing the liquidation of my remaining shell companies and transferring the vast majority of my liquid assets into secure philanthropic trusts. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I finally stepped out of the towering glass lobby of Bennett's law firm located in the absolute center of the financial district. A heavy gray rain was washing the city streets, pulling a bitter, biting chill through the concrete canyons. I stood under the deep architectural awning of the building, adjusting the thick collar of my wool overcoat, while I waited for my private driver to bring the town car around to the curb. The world around me felt incredibly quiet and orderly, but the ghosts of my immediate past were not entirely ready to let me go. I noticed a solitary figure huddled against the cold granite wall near the very edge of the awning. She was completely drenched, shivering violently in the damp afternoon air. She wore a thin beige trench coat over a pair of cheap gray sweatpants, a jarring and pathetic departure from the imported silk gowns and custom tailoring she used to parade around the luxury estate. Her hair was plastered to her pale face in wet, dark strands. It was Lauren. She had been waiting out here in the freezing rain for God knows how long, tracking my daily movements, or perhaps simply staking out the only location she knew I still frequented. When she saw me step through the heavy revolving doors, she pushed herself off the wet granite and stumbled forward. She did not walk with the arrogant, entitled strut of a wealthy heiress anymore. She moved like a desperate, terrified beggar. Before I could even raise a hand to signal the building security guards standing just inside the glass, she closed the distance between us and immediately collapsed onto the wet pavement right at my feet. The cold rainwater pooled around her knees, soaking through her thin clothes, but she did not seem to care at all. She reached out and grabbed the hem of my wool overcoat, her hands completely blue and shaking from the freezing temperature. The tears started instantly mixing with the heavy rain pouring down her face. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and bloodshot, pleading for a salvation she absolutely did not deserve. "Daddy, please!" she sobbed, her voice cracking and echoing loudly against the smooth glass facade of the office building. "Please, just look at me. You have to listen to me. I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry for everything that happened." I did not pull my coat away from her desperate grip, but I did not reach down to help her up either. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the exact woman who had happily co-signed the fraudulent documents to steal my identity and lock me in a secure psychiatric ward. "I did not know what he was doing," Lauren cried, violently shaking her head to emphasize her fabricated innocence. "Charles manipulated me. He controlled every single aspect of our lives. You know how aggressive he gets. You saw him throw that freezing water in your face last week. I was completely terrified of him, Daddy. He put those complicated loan papers in front of me and forced me to sign them. I never read them. I never wanted to hurt you or steal your money. He lied to me just like he lied to you and to those wealthy investors. I am a victim too. He ruined my entire life, and he left me with absolutely nothing." I listened to her desperate theatrical monologue, listening very carefully to the specific words she chose to use. She was an absolute master of deflecting accountability. She was desperately trying to rewrite history, painting herself as a helpless hostage rather than a willing and eager accomplice to a federal crime. She conveniently forgot the cruel, condescending comments she made to me in the kitchen. She forgot telling me that I owed them for my room and board. She forgot standing by and smirking while her husband humiliated me in front of his guests. Now that Charles was locked in a federal holding cell and entirely useless to her financial future, she was perfectly willing to throw him directly under the bus to save her own skin. "I have absolutely nowhere to go," Lauren wailed, her grip tightening frantically on the heavy wool fabric of my coat. "The bank seized my car yesterday morning. They froze every single account I have. All of my friends have completely blocked my phone number. I spent the last 3 nights sleeping on a hard plastic chair in a public bus terminal. I am starving, and I am so unbelievably cold. Please, Daddy, I know you have money." I heard what the federal judge said in the courtroom. "You are a billionaire. You can fix all of this misery with a single phone call. Just get me a small apartment. Just pay my rent for a few months until I can get back on my feet and find a job. I will do whatever you want. I will take care of you. We can be a real family again. Please do not leave me out here to die in the street." Her begging reached a frantic fever pitch, her voice echoing down the busy metropolitan sidewalk. A few pedestrians in expensive business suits hurried past us, casting uncomfortable, judging glances at the pathetic scene unfolding under the awning. Lauren was actively weaponizing her misery, trying to trigger the deep paternal instinct I had harbored and nurtured for decades. She was deliberately using the word daddy, a title she had not used with any genuine affection since she was 10 years old. She believed that beneath my cold exterior, there was still a soft and forgiving father who could not bear to see his little girl suffer the consequences of her own actions. She truly believed that the massive wealth I possessed meant my forgiveness was something she could simply demand through a theatrical display of suffering. She thought a few tears and a fabricated story about being manipulated by her husband would instantly erase the profound evil she had committed against me. She looked up at me, her face twisted in a mask of calculated agony, waiting for me to break. She was waiting for me to reach down, pull her into a warm, protective embrace, and promise her that the terrible nightmare was over. She was waiting for the unconditional financial bailout she had received her entire life. I looked at her trembling hands clutching my expensive coat. I looked at the dirty rain washing the remnants of expensive makeup from her pale face. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy. The familiar hollow ache I used to feel whenever she was in pain had been completely and permanently removed from my soul. I saw straight through the pathetic performance. She was not crying because she finally realized she had been a terrible, abusive daughter. She was crying because she had permanently lost her limitless bank account. She was mourning the loss of the massive mansion, the designer clothes, and the imported wine. I was not a father to her in this raw moment. I was merely a human checkbook she was desperately trying to cash one final time. I looked down at the woman kneeling in the freezing rain. She was desperately waiting for the familiar warmth of my forgiveness, waiting for the invisible safety net to catch her one last time. For 3 decades, I had rushed to fix every mistake she ever made. If she broke a toy, I bought a new one. If she crashed a car, I paid the insurance deductible. I had built a massive wall of money around her to protect her from the harshness of the world. And inside that comfortable fortress, she had grown into an absolute monster. I did not feel anger anymore. The burning rage that had fueled my calculated revenge over the past week had entirely burned out, leaving behind nothing but a profound and heavy pity. She was a hollow shell of a human being completely incapable of surviving the reality she had maliciously created for herself. I reached down and gently pulled the wet fabric of my heavy wool overcoat from her desperate grip. She gasped loudly, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes, finally realizing that the safety net was permanently gone. I did not raise my voice above the sound of the falling rain. I did not need to yell to completely destroy her remaining illusions. I paid your rent for 30 years. Lauren, I said, my voice carrying the absolute finality of a judge delivering a life sentence. I bought your clothes, I funded your luxury lifestyle, and I paid for every single privilege you ever enjoyed, and it cost me my daughter. You traded my unconditional love for a bank account, and you traded my freedom for a fraudulent husband. I am not going to rescue you today. It is time you learned what things actually cost in the real world. A long, sleek black town car pulled smoothly up to the curb beside us, its heavy tires hissing against the wet asphalt. The rear door opened automatically. Lauren let out a raw, agonizing scream, scrambling forward on her knees across the rough, wet pavement, desperately trying to grab my polished leather shoes, begging for just one more chance. I stepped gracefully into the warm leather interior of the vehicle, ignoring her completely. I sat back against the plush seat and looked out through the open door. She was sobbing uncontrollably, her hands reaching out into the empty, cold space I had just occupied. I reached forward and pressed the small silver button on the door panel. The heavy door pulled shut with a solid, satisfying thud. The thick tinted glass window rolled up seamlessly instantly, cutting off the sound of her frantic apologies and her desperate cries for her father. I did not look back as the driver smoothly pulled the car away from the curb. I left her sitting entirely alone on the freezing sidewalk, finally abandoned to face the absolute ruin of her own making. And to you listening to this story, remember this: do not make the same mistake I did. I trusted money to test love, and sometimes that test reveals painful truths. I should have relied more on faith, patience, and wisdom. God sees the hearts of people long before we do. God understands loyalty better than wealth ever could. And when everything collapses, it is often God who reminds us what truly matters. This painful chapter of my life became a lesson about family betrayal, a reminder that even the closest relationships can fall apart when greed replaces respect. Every family story carries a warning hidden inside it. In my own family story, I waited too long to see what was right in front of me. That is why I say this, clearly do not let pride, silence, or blind love trap you in a life shaped by family betrayal. Personally, I believe wealth should build futures, not destroy families. Respect is more valuable than inheritance. Loyalty is worth more than luxury. And sometimes walking away is the only way to protect your peace. If this family story meant something to you, share your thoughts in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Your voice keeps this conversation alive. If you found meaning in this story about family betrayal, consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next family story we explore together. Thank you sincerely for staying with me until the very end. One gentle note before we part: some of the upcoming stories may include dramatized elements